Picture a room inside the Great Palace of Constantinople on the night of December 10th, 969. Not a throne room, not a banquet hall, a private chamber with no fire, no lamp burning, no sound from the city outside, except the wind off the Marmara coming through the cold stone walls. One figure lying on the floor in the dark, not on the bed that stood nearby, on the floor itself, on a rough wool garment, the way a soldier sleeps in a camp when there is no better option and comfort has stopped being a consideration. The man on that floor was the most powerful person in the known world. He had taken back an island lost for 135 years. He had pushed the frontier of the empire further east than any emperor in 3 centuries. He had written down what war required in a document that other commanders would study for generations. He had built a monastery on a rocky peninsula in the north that still stands today. More than 1,000 years later, because stone and faith together produce a particular kind of permanence. His name was Nikephoros Phokas, Emperor of the Romans, commander of the Byzantine Empire at the height of its military revival, and tonight, while he slept on that cold floor in the manner he had slept since he was a young soldier on the eastern frontier, a group of men was moving through the palace toward him. They had not come from the Arab East. They had not crossed the sea from an enemy harbour. They had come through a window, in the dark, with swords, and among the people who had made that entry possible was the woman he had married. He would not survive the night. This is the life of the man who helped pull an empire back from the edge, and could not save himself. Settle in, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Empire on the Edge. Stand inside the walls of Constantinople for a moment. Not the idea of them. The physical reality, stone, 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, built in the early 5th century, and still unbreached by any outside enemy 500 years later. A city of perhaps 400,000 people behind those walls, with running water, a functioning university, hospitals, a hippodrome that seated 100,000, and a harbour receiving merchant ships from every direction. The largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, in an era when Rome itself had been reduced to perhaps 30,000 people living among the ruins of what it had once been. Those walls said something. They said that this city had been here before most of the world's current powers existed, and intended to remain after most of them had passed. That statement had been tested many times. It had held. But take a breath. Step back from the walls and look at the world pressing against them from every direction at once. Because that is the world that shaped Nikephoros Phokas. And without understanding the pressure, the man himself does not quite make sense. To the east lay 3 centuries of contested frontier with the Arab world. The relationship between Byzantium and its Arab neighbours was not simple hatred. There were truces, trade agreements, periods of genuine cultural exchange. Byzantine and Arab scholars read each other's work. The 2 civilizations were, in important ways, more entangled than later centuries would sometimes acknowledge. But there were also 300 years of raiding, battle, and territorial struggle across a frontier that stretched from the Black Sea south through what is now eastern Turkey and Syria toward the edges of the Levant, and the frontier had been moving against Byzantium, not catastrophically, not in a single decisive collapse, but steadily in the way that a tide moves. Each retreat small enough to absorb and large enough to accumulate. The island of Crete had fallen to Arab forces in the 820s. It had been in Arab hands ever since. From Crete, pirates and raiders operated across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean with a freedom that made every coastal settlement vulnerable. The island was not simply a political embarrassment. It was a wound that bled the empire's commercial and naval capacity every year it remained occupied. And it had been bleeding for more than a century by the time Nikephoros was born. To the north, the Bulgarian Empire had spent most of the 9th and early 10th centuries in active conflict with Constantinople, at moments pressing to the city walls themselves. The Rus from Kiev had conducted raids against the capital within living memory. To the west, the Germanic Emperor Otto I had been crowned by the Pope in 962 in a ceremony explicitly designed to claim that the real heir to Rome was not in Constantinople, but in Central Europe. The empire was a great power under simultaneous pressure on every frontier at once. And it had been that way long enough that pressure had become the default condition. The emperors and commanders of this era were not defending a stable situation. They were holding a line that required constant, active effort to maintain. The moment that effort relaxed, somewhere on that enormous perimeter, something would give. That is what the world looked like in the year 963, which is where the active story of this life begins. And that is why a frontier military family from the inland plateau of Cappadocia, unknown to most of the people in Constantinople, producing soldiers for generations in conditions that the capital barely thought about, would turn out to matter so much to what came next. The empire needed exactly what that family had been quietly building for 100 years. It was about to find it. Chapter 2. Born into War. Picture the landscape first. Cappadocia sits in the centre of what is now Turkey, a vast inland plateau where the geology does something that looks almost impossible. Ancient volcanic eruptions deposited soft rock across the plain, and millennia of wind and water carved that rock into formations that rise from the flat ground like the towers of a city no human being designed. Valleys cut deep and sudden into the surface. The horizon in every direction is enormous. The winters come hard and stay late. The summers are dry in a way that produces a particular kind of toughness in the people who work the land there. A toughness that is not dramatic or loud, but simply settled, the way a stone is settled, shaped by conditions that did not ask permission before applying pressure. This was where the Phokas family came from. Not from Constantinople's courtly world of silk merchants and palace officials and literary intellectuals who measured their standing by proximity to the emperor. From the plateau, from the frontier, from a landscape that produced people whose understanding of what was real had been formed by conditions that the capital, behind its impenetrable walls, did not fully experience and did not always fully understand. The Phokas family had been producing soldiers for generations before Nikephoros was born, always in connection with military command, always in connection with the eastern frontier, always in the places where the empire's survival was most actively contested. His grandfather had built the family's early reputation through decades of service. His father, Byzantine Phokas the Elder, rose to positions of genuine military authority within the theme system that organized Byzantine provincial power. His uncle, also named Byzantine Phokas, would become one of the most formidable commanders of the middle 10th century. The family did not produce one exceptional figure by accident. It produced multiple exceptional figures by design. Through a culture of formation that treated military competence as the most important inheritance a family could pass on. Byzantine sources from this era describe the households of frontier military families in terms that make the difference from capital aristocracy clear. Boys in these households learned to ride before most children in Constantinople learned to read. Weapons handling was not a supplementary skill added to a standard education. It was the discipline around which everything else was organized. Military logistics, terrain assessment, the management of men under pressure. These were absorbed not through formal instruction primarily, but through the kind of continuous exposure that happens when a child grows up, surrounded by people for whom these things are the daily substance of life. It was not a comfortable existence. The eastern frontier in the early 10th century was genuinely dangerous, and the families that served there understood that not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact that arrived without announcement. Arab raiding parties crossed the frontier with regularity. The distances between settlements were large enough that help was rarely immediate when needed. The people who held the border held it through a combination of preparation and a psychological toughness that was not bravado, not the performed courage of men who have never been tested, but the settled composure of people who had learned from childhood that the land they lived on did not negotiate and did not offer second chances to those who were not ready. Nikephoros Phokas was born into that inheritance sometime in the early 900s and 10s, though Byzantine sources do not record the exact date, and historians, working with the available evidence, place his birth within a range of several years around that period. He was the second son of Bardas Phokas the elder, which placed him in an interesting position within the family structure. His older brother Leo would also become a significant military commander. The family system was working as designed. The world outside the family in the years of his childhood was actively shaping the conditions that would define his adult career. The Hamdanid emirate, centered in Mosul and later in Aleppo under its remarkable leader Saif al-Dawla, was building its power on the eastern frontier with increasing ambition. The Bulgarian situation to the north had only recently stabilized. The Rus raid on Constantinople in 941 had been repelled but not forgotten. Every adult in a frontier military household during these years was aware, in the immediate and practical way that proximity to danger produces, that the empire they served was being tested from multiple directions, and that the testing was not going to stop. For a boy growing up in that environment, these were not distant events. They were the reason for everything. The reason why the adults around him prepared the way they did. The reason why readiness mattered more than comfort. The reason why a family like the Phocades had built its identity around exactly the kind of service that the empire, in these years, most urgently needed. He did not choose to become a soldier. He was formed as one. The way a river is formed by the shape of the land it flows through, not by deciding to go in a particular direction, but by responding to the conditions that were already there. What he would eventually do with that formation, no one in the family could have fully predicted. But the formation itself was complete before his career had properly begun. Chapter 3. The Making of a General. There is a document in the historical record, written in Greek, attributed by scholars to Nikephoros Phokas himself, or to a small circle working under his direct supervision during his reign. Its Latin title is praecepta militaria, military precepts, military instructions. Hold that image for a moment. Not the title, the act of writing it. A man who spent 3 decades in active command on the most demanding frontier the Byzantine Empire possessed, who led armies through conditions that most people did not survive, who watched what worked and what failed in the specific physical reality of desert and mountain and contested ground, and who then sat down and wrote it all out, not as memoir, not as self-glorification, as instruction, as a body of knowledge meant to outlast him and be used by the commanders who came after. Historians of Byzantine warfare study it today as a primary source for understanding how the empire fought in the 10th century. That alone tells you something about the man who produced it. The central problem the Praecepta Militaria addresses is a specific one that Byzantine commanders faced on the eastern frontier in this period. Arab cavalry forces of the Hamdanid type were exceptionally mobile. They were skilled at rapid movement, at striking before Byzantine formations could fully deploy, at drawing pursuing units forward and then turning on them when the pursuit had stretched their lines and tired their horses. On open ground, in a direct engagement, against a mobile enemy who had chosen the terrain and the timing, the risk to a Byzantine force was real, and had been demonstrated by the outcomes of previous commanders who had not thought carefully enough about it. The response Nikephoros developed and committed to writing was not the response of a man who wanted the dramatic confrontation. It was the opposite: use heavy infantry as a disciplined anchor, not as a battering force sent directly against cavalry in the open. Use skirmishing cavalry to harass without committing. Force the enemy to react rather than to act. Deny them the clean disengagement they preferred. Wear them down through a series of controlled engagements rather than a single decisive clash. Then, when the enemy is tired and their formation compromised and their supply position weakening, apply decisive force. Simple in description, extraordinarily difficult in execution, because it required a quality of unit discipline that soldiers who were capable of winning tended to resist. Being soldiers, and therefore inclined toward fighting rather than waiting, it required commanders at every level to suppress the instinct toward the dramatic gesture. The heroic charge that might win glory or might shatter a formation and expose an entire column to the consequences. And it required logistics planning of a kind that most armies in this period handled poorly, because a patient campaign of attrition was only possible if supply lines remained functional under exactly the conditions in which they were most vulnerable to disruption. Nikephoros spent the early years of his career learning these things, not from books, but from results. The eastern frontier in the 930s and 940s graded performance immediately and permanently. Arab commanders of the Hamdanid period were experienced and capable. They did not offer second chances to Byzantine commanders who deployed incorrectly on the first engagement. What Nikephoros built through those years was the particular kind of reputation that the Byzantine military system valued above almost any other. Not the reputation for a single brilliant victory, the reputation for coming back, for taking a force into the frontier and returning with the objectives achieved and the losses within acceptable bounds, again and again, in conditions that had broken other commanders. His relationship with the soldiers under him was, according to Leo the Deacon and consistent with other Byzantine sources of the period, genuinely unusual for a man of his social position and eventual rank. He ate with them. He slept in the same conditions. He did not maintain the physical separation between commander and soldiers that Byzantine military culture generally expected at his level. Leo the Deacon records this not as an exceptional act of deliberate solidarity, but as the expression of a personal temperament that found the ordinary comforts of rank genuinely unnecessary rather than symbolically worth sacrificing. That distinction matters. A man who gives up comfort to make a point is performing. A man who gives up comfort because he genuinely does not require it is something else. The soldiers who served under Nikephoros appear to have understood which kind they were dealing with, and they organized themselves around it in the way that soldiers organize themselves around a commander they believe in. By his late 30s, he had been appointed to command the forces of the Anatolikon theme, one of the most important military postings in the empire, covering the central portion of what is now Turkey and sitting directly on the most active section of the eastern frontier. This was not a ceremonial appointment. It was the posting of a man the system had been watching and had decided could be trusted with what the position required. It placed him, for the first time at command level, directly opposite the man who was, by this point, the dominant military figure on the Arab side of the frontier. Saif al-Dawla, the Hamdanid ruler of Aleppo, was one of the most capable Arab commanders of the 10th century, celebrated in Arab literary culture as a warrior prince of the old tradition, feared by Byzantine commanders who had learned from experience that fighting him on his preferred terms was a reliable way to lose. The campaigns between Nikephoros and Saif al-Dawla across the 940s and early 950s were not a clean story of Byzantine dominance. They were a grinding, back-and-forth contest across a frontier that neither side fully controlled. There were Byzantine reverses. There were moments when the principles of the Precepta Militaria were tested by circumstances that did not conform to them, and the results were imperfect. What was consistent, across years of that contest, was that Nikephoros' forces maintained their operational capacity. They came back, they recovered, and the system they embodied was getting better, faster than the balance of the frontier was shifting in the Arab direction. The climax of this phase of his career came in 955, when he conducted a campaign into Cilicia, the region along the southeastern coast of what is now Turkey. That had been effectively a raiding ground for Arab forces for generations. He took it, and then he did something that the earlier years of frontier fighting had built toward without fully expressing. He held it. He garrisoned it. He incorporated it into the Byzantine administrative and supply system in a functional sense rather than a symbolic one. That step, the step from winning to holding, was what told the people in Constantinople, who were paying attention, something they had needed to know. He was not simply a frontier commander who had grown old enough to achieve seniority. He was a strategic thinker operating at a level the empire had urgent need of, and there was a problem he had not yet been given that was about to become his. An Iceland, lost for 135 years. The wound in the Mediterranean that no one before him had been able to close. Chapter 4. The Reconquest begins. Crete. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship in the summer of 960, somewhere in the Aegean Sea, and watching the horizon fill with sails. Not a few sails, hundreds, ships of every size in the Byzantine fleet, loaded with soldiers, horses, siege equipment, and the supplies calculated to sustain a large army through a campaign of uncertain length in territory that could not be relied upon to feed them. The fleet stretched across the water in a way that was itself a statement, a physical declaration that something different was happening, that this was not a raid or a probe or a show of force designed to be seen and then withdrawn. This was an invasion, designed from the beginning to take an island and hold it. The island was Crete. It had fallen to Arab forces in the 820s, seized by a group of Andalusian Arabs displaced from the Iberian Peninsula who had recognized that Crete's position, sitting astride the main sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean, made it worth holding at almost any cost. They had been right. The island's harbour at Chandax, which they had fortified into one of the most formidable naval bases in the eastern Mediterranean, gave them a platform from which raiders could strike in almost any direction and withdraw before a Byzantine response could be organised. The Aegean was not safe. The coastal settlements of Greece, Asia Minor, and the islands had lived under the reality of those raids for more than a century, with a consistency that had become simply part of the condition of living near the sea. Byzantine commanders had tried to take Crete back before Nikephoros multiple times. The attempts had failed with a consistency that was itself a problem, because each failure reinforced the lesson that Crete was unrecoverable, that the fortifications at Chandax were too strong, that the logistics of a sustained amphibious operation across open water were too difficult to maintain, that the island was simply beyond reach. Nikephoros did not accept that lesson. What he accepted was the analysis beneath it, which was different. The previous attempts had failed not because Crete was unrecoverable in principle, but because they had been conducted with insufficient force, insufficient preparation, and insufficient willingness to commit to a siege of the length that Chandax actually required. The problem was not the island. The problem was that no previous commander had been given the resources, or had been willing to ask for them, to do the job properly. Nikephoros asked for them. Emperor Romanos II authorized the campaign at the scale Nikephoros believed necessary. The force assembled was, by the standards of 10th century Byzantine military operations, enormous. Lish, must hair, 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 must hair. Leo the Deacon describes hair, and historians working from Byzantine military records have debated the exact numbers, placing the expeditionary force somewhere in a range that scholars have argued over for generations, without consensus on a precise figure. What is not in dispute is the character of the operation. This was not a raid. The naval component alone, the ships required to transport, supply, and support an army across open water, and then maintain a blockade against resupply of the defended harbour, represented a commitment of imperial resources at a level the empire had not attempted in this direction for a very long time. The fleet sailed from Constantinople in the summer of 960. The landing on Crete was contested. Arab forces did not allow an army of that size to come ashore unopposed. The initial operations involved fighting on the beaches and in the immediate coastal terrain, and Leo the Deacon's account makes clear it was not a clean or easy process. Nikephoros' forces established a beachhead, fought to expand it, and began moving inland toward Chandax. What followed was a siege, not a brief assault that ended in triumph within days. A long, methodical siege of a fortified city that had been built and improved specifically to resist exactly this kind of attack. Chandax had walls. It had a harbour that Arab ships could still use to bring in supplies. At least initially, it had a garrison that had every reason to hold, because a century of Arab occupation had produced no illusions about the terms of Byzantine recapture. Nikephoros settled in. That single phrase, those 3 words, describe the quality that the earlier failed attempts had lacked, and that the Praecepta Militaria identified as essential. He did not need to storm the walls immediately. He needed to make the walls irrelevant over time, to cut the supply lines, to reduce the garrison's capacity through attrition rather than through a single dramatic assault that might succeed or might fail at enormous cost. The naval component worked to close the harbour. The siege lines on land tightened. The defenders held. The siege continued through the summer, into autumn, into winter, when conditions for both sides became harder and the distance from home became something that every soldier on both sides measured differently. Through all of it, the sources suggest that Nikephoros maintained among his troops the same quality he had built during his frontier years: the disciplined, patient persistence of a force that believed its commander knew where this was going and was simply proceeding toward it without improvisation. That quality is not automatic, and it does not maintain itself. It requires the active presence of a command structure that provides coherence when active operations are not providing it. Nikephoros provided it, in the way he always had, by sharing the conditions he was asking his soldiers to endure. By the early months of 961, Chandax could not hold. The blockade was holding. The food supply inside the walls was declining to a point where continued resistance was a question of how long the garrison could endure, not whether it could ultimately prevail. The final assault came in the spring of 961. The city was taken. Nikephoros Phokas had done what no Byzantine commander before him had managed in 135 years. Crete was home. The Aegean coast settlements that had lived under the reality of Arab raids from that island for longer than anyone alive could remember were now in a different world. The merchants who moved goods through those waters operated under conditions that had materially changed. The psychological effect on the empire's sense of what was recoverable, where the line between permanent loss and retrievable territory actually ran, was harder to measure precisely, but impossible to dismiss. He returned to Constantinople. The city celebrated. The emperor received him with a formal triumph. But Nikephoros was already thinking east. Crete had been the island problem, the unfinished business of a century and a half. The eastern frontier was something older and harder and more fundamental. He would not stay long. Chapter 5. Syria, Aleppo, and the cost of conquest. The eastern frontier was not a line. Stand at the edge of what Byzantine commanders called the contested zone in the 950s, and what you see is not a boundary between two powers, but a landscape of overlapping authority. Arab and Byzantine control, mixing and shifting across a terrain of valleys and mountain passes and fortified towns, whose loyalties followed the military situation rather than any permanent commitment. Towns changed hands. The same settlement might find itself under Byzantine protection in one decade, and raided by Hamdanid cavalry in the next, without ever becoming formally part of either empire's administrative structure. The major cities of the region, Antioch, Aleppo. The settlements of Cilicia had their own calculations about which power it was more advantageous to accommodate at any given moment. This was the world Nikephoros returned to after Crete. He returned with an army that carried something new, not just the practical experience of the Cretan campaign, though that was real and transferable, something harder to name precisely. The specific confidence of a force that has proven to itself what it is capable of. That kind of confidence, when it is genuine rather than performed, changes how an army moves through contested terrain. It changes how quickly decisions are made. It changes the threshold between waiting and acting. It changes what the soldiers on the other side can feel when they are standing across the field from it. The Hamdanid forces defending the Syrian frontier felt it. Saif al-Dawla, who had been the dominant military figure on the Arab side of the eastern frontier for 2 decades, was by the early 960s dealing with a compound of difficulties. His emirate was under pressure from multiple directions, internal as well as external. The resources he could bring to bear on the Byzantine frontier were not what they had been in the years of his peak strength. Arab sources from the period describe a man whose military genius remained intact, but whose strategic situation was deteriorating in ways that genius alone could not reverse. The Byzantine campaigns through Cilicia and into Syria moved with a speed and decisiveness that reflected both the quality of Nikephoros' force and the changed strategic situation that the Cilician reorganization had produced. Byzantine armies swept through territories that had been contested for decades. Fortified positions that had required extended siege operations in previous campaigns fell in sequence. The Hamdanid defenders were not inferior soldiers. They were operating against a Byzantine army that had been improving its operational capacity for years, led by a commander who knew the terrain, knew the enemy's methods, and had prepared for this campaign with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything else. The siege of Aleppo came in 962. Nikephoros brought his forces to the city that had been the centre of Hamdanid power and the symbolic heart of Arab resistance on the eastern frontier. He did not take it. This decision, which can appear puzzling at first reading, reveals something important about the quality of intelligence Nikephoros brought to war at this level. Aleppo was defensible. Its walls were strong. A prolonged siege would have stretched Byzantine supply lines to a point where the gains of the Syrian campaign might be compromised by the cost of the final step. More importantly, Saif al-Dawla had withdrawn from the city before Nikephoros arrived. Even a successful storming of Aleppo would not eliminate Hamdanid military capacity. Only occupy a city that would then require garrisoning at considerable ongoing expense. Historians of Byzantine military strategy generally read this as a calculated preference for placing Aleppo in a position of dependency over the costs of direct occupation. Whether it reflected Nikephoros' own strategic reasoning, or a combination of factors, including the practical difficulties of the siege, is not something the available sources allow us to establish with certainty. What is clear is that the result served Byzantine interests, and Aleppo became a tributary rather than a prize. Saif al-Dawla died in 967. He spent the last years of his life watching the frontier. He had devoted his life to defending contract around him. The world he had entered as a young commander was barely recognizable by the end. The territories he had raided, the Byzantine commanders he had outfought in the earlier decades, the sense of Arab strategic momentum on the eastern frontier, these things had all changed. And the primary reason they had changed was the body of work produced by Nikephoros Phokas across 30 years. Now pause here, because something else was happening during these years that the military record alone does not capture, something that was building quietly in the west, while Nikephoros looked east. And that mattered more than any single campaign to the shape of what came next. The dispatches from Constantinople reaching Nikephoros in the field during the Syrian campaigns were not purely logistical. They carried the kind of news that a commander paying careful attention could not receive without understanding that two different stories were being told about the same war. In the east, the story was of recovery, of a frontier moving in the right direction, of an empire that had been bleeding for a century beginning to heal. In the city, the story was different. The taxes required to fund armies of the scale Nikephoros commanded were real. They fell on people who did not experience the victories those armies achieved. A merchant in Constantinople, paying elevated duties on his imports, did not feel the reopening of the Aegean trade lanes in his daily life, the way a sailor who had operated under constant threat of Cretan Arab pirates felt the removal of that threat. The tax was present and immediate. The strategic gain was distant and abstract. There is a quality to this distance between military success and domestic support that recurs across the histories of empires that fight long wars on distant frontiers. It is not ingratitude. Exactly. It is the natural consequence of the fact that people experience what happens to them directly, and only understand what they have been spared from in retrospect, if at all. Nikephoros could look west from his position in Syria and understand, without any particular gift for political intuition, that what he was building on the frontier and what the people behind those walls in Constantinople were experiencing were two entirely different things. He was winning in the east. He was losing something in the west. The full weight of that tension had not yet declared itself. He was still a general, still answerable to an emperor who authorized his campaigns and celebrated his victories. The institutional framework within which he operated was intact, but Romanos II was not well, and the stability that his reign represented was more fragile than it appeared from the eastern frontier. The question of what would happen when that stability broke was about to become the most important question in the empire, and the answer would change everything. Chapter 6. The Throne. Romanos II died in the spring of 963. He was 24 years old. 24. Let that number settle for a moment, because it explains almost everything about the crisis that followed. A man of 24 has not had time to build the institutional structures that sustain continuity. He has not governed long enough to create the networks of loyalty and obligation that hold a court together when the centre fails. He has not identified a successor in a way that commands general acceptance. He was young enough that his death felt, to the people around him, less like a natural conclusion and more like a door suddenly opening onto a room no one had prepared for. Romanos left behind 2 young sons, Basil, who was 5 years old, Constantine, who was 3. Under Byzantine constitutional practice, they were the legitimate heirs. They were also children who could not govern, could not command armies, could not make the decisions the empire needed made with urgency, and could not project the kind of authority that held frontier commanders to their posts and kept court factions from pursuing their own interests at the expense of everyone else. Between those two children and the chaos their incapacity threatened stood their mother, Theophano. She was probably in her early 20s at the time of Romanos's death. Byzantine sources describe her in terms that reflect genuine difficulty in categorization. Every account acknowledges her intelligence. Every account acknowledges her political perceptiveness. Even the sources hostile to her acknowledge these things, because they are too consistently demonstrated in the record to be dismissed. Whether the ambition they describe was as calculated from the very beginning as they suggest, or whether it developed in response to the conditions she found herself navigating in a world where power and survival were the same question, is not something the available record allows us to determine with confidence. What it does tell us is that she was now the most exposed person in the empire. The man who moved to take control from within was Joseph Bringas, a eunuch administrator who had been the dominant political figure under Romanos and who intended to remain dominant under the regency for the young emperors. Bringas was experienced, capable, and understood perfectly that his continued influence depended on keeping the military commanders on the frontier exactly there, on the frontier, under orders, not making political decisions in Constantinople. On the eastern frontier, the man who had just completed the most consequential military campaigns the empire had seen in a century received the news of Romanos's death and understood immediately what it meant. The sources do not give us a direct record of Nikephoros' inner response to that news. What they give us is the sequence of actions, and John Skylitzes in his Synopsis Historian and Leo the Deacon in his Historia both portray a figure who did not immediately move toward Constantinople, did not immediately declare himself a candidate for anything. He wavered. With the same settled patience he brought to sieges. While the situation in the capital developed around him, Byzantine writers, including both Skylitzes and Leo the Deacon, consistently portray the throne as a burden Nikephoros accepted rather than a prize he actively pursued. Whether this reflected genuine reluctance, or was partly a posture that served his interests to project, or was some combination of the two that even he could not have fully separated, is harder to establish. The sources portray it consistently enough that the portrait has credibility, while the practical result of his actions, marching on the capital with an army, is ambiguous enough that the portrait cannot simply be taken at face value without acknowledging the ambiguity. Bringas moved to neutralize him from a distance. The attempt failed. The army on the eastern frontier proclaimed Nikephoros emperor. In the recognized, though constitutionally irregular, Byzantine practice by which military commanders had been raised to the purple before and would be raised again, the soldiers who had followed him through Crete and the Syrian campaigns, who had watched him eat what they ate and sleep where they slept, extended the trust they had built over decades of shared danger into the larger question of who should govern. From their perspective, it was not a dramatic leap. Nikephoros marched toward Constantinople. Bringas attempted to organize resistance. The resistance dissolved. The city opened its gates in August of 963. The civilian bureaucrat who had hoped to manage the succession from within discovered that the management had already been performed from without. There remained the question of form. The two young sons of Romanos were still the legitimate emperors. Nikephoros was not going to erase them. The logic of the situation, and everything the sources tell us about his political instincts, pointed toward a framework that gave him the authority to govern while preserving the formal continuity of the dynasty. The solution was unexpected even by Byzantine standards. Nikephoros Phokas, 50 years old, the most formidable military commander of his generation, a man who had spent his entire adult life on campaign and who by every account lived and thought like a soldier monk rather than a courtier, married the young widow of the emperor he was replacing. He married Theophano. The political logic is clear enough, and Byzantine sources, including Skylitzes, emphasize it explicitly. Marriage to the mother of the legitimate emperors gave Nikephoros a formal dynastic connection that made the arrangement constitutionally coherent and gave Theophano a continued position at the centre of imperial power rather than the marginal existence that widowed empresses typically faced. It gave the court, the church, and the population a framework within which to accept what had happened. The human reality of the arrangement was more complicated, and the sources reflect that complication without resolving it. Nikephoros, by this point, had been living for years in a manner that every Byzantine source describes consistently as ascetic, a hair shirt beneath his military garments, simple and infrequent meals, the stone floor rather than the bed. His connections before his rise had been with monks and holy men of the Eastern tradition, with the ascetic world that the military career and the religious discipline shared as expressions of the same fundamental orientation towards self-denial. For a man of that formation to enter a political marriage with a young and politically formidable woman whose relationship to the court world was as fluent as his own was constrained, was not a step that the available sources allow us to frame as a personal choice made for personal reasons. The sources portray it as a decision made within the logic of the moment. The patriarch Polyeuctos initially refused to perform the ceremony. His objection was canonical. Nikephoros had served as godfather to one of Theophano's children, which under Byzantine ecclesiastical law created a form of spiritual kinship that prohibited marriage. The objection was eventually resolved, though the tension it produced between Nikephoros and the church hierarchy would persist throughout his reign and become, in time, one of the fissures that his enemies would use. On the 16th of August, 963, Nikephoros Phokas was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the Hagia Sophia. The man on the cold stone floor had arrived at the position from which the cold stone floor looked most incongruous. He was now inside the walls he had spent his life protecting, and the war he had spent his life fighting, the war on the outside, was the war he understood. What was gathering on the inside was something else entirely. Chapter 7. The Emperor at War and at Prayer. There is a peninsula in northern Greece that extends into the Aegean Sea like a long, narrow finger pointed south, 30 miles from base to tip, rising at the southern end to a peak of more than 6,000 feet, visible from a distance at sea on a clear day as a dark shape against the horizon, neither fully land nor fully water in the way it sits between the two. Access has always been by boat. The rocks at the waterline are old and grey, and indifferent to the weather that comes off the sea in winter. The trees on the slopes have been growing since before most of the institutions of the modern world existed. The peninsula is called Mount Athos. The oldest monastery on that peninsula is called Megisti Lavra, the Great Lavra. It was founded in 963. It was founded with resources provided by Nikephoros Phokas. That fact is not legend. It is documented in Byzantine sources, including the hagiographic account of the monastery's founder, the monk known as Athanasius of Athos, and it is confirmed by the physical existence of the monastery itself, which has been continuously occupied from 963 to the present day, more than 1,060 years. A person with the appropriate permit can visit it today. The church, built in the 10th century with the resources of a Byzantine emperor who slept on stone floors, is a physical object that exists in the world right now. That is where we begin this chapter. Not with the campaigns that continued after 963, not with the political conflicts that accumulated during the reign, but with that peninsula and that monastery, because it tells us something about Nikephoros Phokas that the military record alone cannot fully convey. He believed that what he did in the world required a spiritual accounting. The monk Athanasius had been associated with Nikephoros for years before the founding of the Lavra, living for periods in the military encampments of the eastern frontier, which was unusual for a man of his standing. Byzantine sources that describe their relationship portray something more than the ordinary connection between a powerful patron and a grateful recipient. They portray a genuine spiritual affinity between two men who shared an orientation toward the ascetic tradition of Eastern Christianity that expressed itself differently in their different lives, but came from the same root. For Athanasius, it expressed itself in the founding of a permanent monastic community in one of the most physically remote locations accessible to a person on foot and by sea. For Nikephoros, it expressed itself in the same habits the sources record throughout his entire adult life: the hair shirt beneath the military garments, the stone floor rather than the bed, the simple and infrequent meals, the fasting maintained according to a discipline that the monks who observed it recognized as serious rather than performative. He wore the purple. He observed the ceremonies. He appeared in the Hagia Sophia on the occasions that required imperial presence. He did what the position demanded in terms of public visibility and formal representation, and then he went back to the stone floor. The Byzantine imperial court did not know quite what to make of this. The ceremonial system of the court, codified in elaborate detail in the generation before Nikephoros, and embodying centuries of accumulated practice, was built around the emperor as a figure of sacred magnificence. The visual splendor of the imperial presence was not decoration, it was communication. It told everyone who observed it, the court, the church, visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, that the authority of the Roman emperor was legitimate, divinely sanctioned, and continuous with the authority that had governed the civilized world for 1,000 years. The emperor, who could not or would not project that splendor, was undermining a language that the entire institutional structure of the empire depended on. Nikephoros projected it when required. What he could not do, or what he appears to have found genuinely impossible rather than simply inconvenient, was to inhabit it in the private hours, when the ceremonies were over and the court had dispersed, and the palace returned to the ordinary conditions of a large building housing a complicated institution. In those hours he was what he had always been, a soldier of the eastern frontier who had decided at some point, early enough that the sources cannot identify the moment, that the comforts his position could provide were not things he needed or perhaps deserved. He continued to campaign personally after becoming emperor. This was not unusual in the Byzantine military revival tradition, but the degree to which Nikephoros remained a field commander rather than a remote director of operations was notable. he led the campaigns that brought Cyprus back under firm Byzantine control in 965. He was in the field, with the army, in the conditions that command requires, rather than managing the war from behind the palace walls. Cyprus completed what the Eastern strategy had been building toward since Crete. The island had been under Arab influence in varying degrees for 3 centuries. Its return to firm Byzantine control, combined with the secured positions in Cilicia and Syria and the constrained Hamdanid power base in Aleppo, meant that the eastern Mediterranean had been transformed. The chain of operations from Crete to Cilicia to Syria to Cyprus had not been accidents or isolated victories. They had been a sequence with a logic, and the logic had been applied consistently over more than a decade. But the campaigns carried costs that the military record alone tends to understate. Men died in Cilicia and Syria and Cyprus. Real men with families in Byzantine towns and villages who did not experience the strategic picture that gave those deaths meaning. They experienced the deaths. The treasury that funded the armies was filled by taxes on people who understood the war primarily through what it cost them. And in the palace, the distance between what Nikephoros was building on the frontier and what Constantinople was experiencing began to accumulate in a way that military success alone could not address. It was in this same period that the theological confrontation with Patriarch Polyeuctos, which had begun with the dispute over the marriage ceremony, extended into a conflict that exposed something important about how Nikephoros understood the relationship between the state and the church. He believed, and argued with genuine conviction according to the sources, that soldiers who died in battle for a Christian empire fighting what Byzantine culture understood as enemies of the faith deserved the same recognition that the church granted to Christian martyrs who had died rather than renounce their beliefs. The argument was not unreasonable on its face. These men had died in defense of a civilization that defined itself in explicitly Christian terms, against opponents that Byzantine theology framed in explicitly religious terms. The distinction between dying for the faith and dying in defense of the empire of the faith seemed, to Nikephoros, too fine to carry the weight the church placed on it. Polyeuctos and the ecclesiastical hierarchy disagreed, not by denying the valour or sacrifice of Byzantine soldiers, but by holding to a theological definition of martyrdom that the Church was not willing to dissolve into a general category of honourable death in the empire's service. The distinction was doctrinal, and it was also institutional, because a church that accepted the emperor's definition would be accepting a significant expansion of imperial authority into a domain the hierarchy had maintained as its own. Nikephoros pressed. The church held. The dispute was documented in Byzantine sources, including the Synopsis Historian of Skylitzes, and it was never resolved during his reign. It added a specific institutional tension to the broader accumulation of grievances that was forming around him. There was also the legislation restricting monastic and ecclesiastical land acquisition, administratively coherent, aimed at preventing the concentration of agricultural wealth in institutions that contributed to the military frontier primarily through prayer rather than through taxes or soldiers, experienced by the ecclesiastical establishment as an attack, remembered by them accordingly. The irony that the sources all note, without labouring it, is worth pausing on here. The man in constant conflict with the institutional church throughout his reign was the same man who had funded the founding of Megisti Lavra on Athos, who wore a hair shirt under his imperial robes. who fasted according to a discipline that impressed the monks who observed it, who appears in every source that describes him as genuinely rather than performatively devout. The personal piety and the political confrontation were not contradictions in his own understanding. His piety was of the ascetic Eastern tradition that had always maintained a complicated relationship with institutional ecclesiastical power, a tradition in which individual spiritual discipline and institutional church authority were not the same thing and did not always point in the same direction. But from the outside, from the perspective of a Constantinople that did not draw those distinctions clearly, it looked like an emperor who fought with the church, taxed the people for wars they were tired of, and came home from his campaigns to sleep on the floor of his palace like a man who did not believe he deserved to live in it. The frontier was holding, the monastery on Athos was standing, the stone floor was cold, and in the corridors of the palace that Nikephoros had fortified against the enemies he understood, something was forming that required a different kind of attention than he had ever fully developed. Chapter 8. The Man the Capital Resented. Picture a street in Constantinople in the autumn of 968, an emperor returning from campaign, not from defeat, from a series of military operations in the east that had, by any measure available to the people who knew how to read such things, continued the expansion of Byzantine power and the containment of the threats that had defined the empire's strategic situation for a generation. Nikephoros Phokas, riding back into the city he governed, toward the palace he had fortified, through streets that should have received him with the ceremony that Byzantine tradition prescribed for victorious emperors. What the sources record instead is hostility. Not organized political resistance, not a formal demonstration mounted by a faction with a program, something raw and in some ways more revealing than either, crowds that did not perform the expected welcome, insults from people who had no particular political agenda beyond the accumulated feeling that this man, whatever he had achieved outside the walls, had cost them something they were not going to pretend they had not noticed. Some accounts mention thrown objects. Leo the Deacon describes the atmosphere in terms that make clear the contrast with how such a return should have looked under Byzantine ceremonial norms. Nikephoros rode through it. He did not stop to address the crowd. He did not make gestures toward reconciliation. He did not offer the symbolic acknowledgments that might have redirected the hostility into something more manageable. According to Leo the Deacon, he observed what was happening with the same settled composure he brought to everything else, and continued toward the palace. That response, that single choice in that single moment, tells you almost everything you need to understand about why his domestic political position had become what it had. To understand how it had gotten there, you need to step back from the military map entirely and look at what Constantinople had been experiencing during the years of distant victory. The taxes required to fund armies of the scale Nikephoros commanded were real, and they fell on people who did not experience the victories those armies achieved in any direct or immediate way. A merchant paying elevated duties on his imports in Constantinople did not feel the reopening of the Aegean trade lanes in his daily transactions the way a sailor who had spent years operating under constant threat of Cretan Arab pirates felt the removal of that threat. The tax was present and immediate. The strategic benefit was distant and required explanation to be understood, and no one in the imperial court was providing that explanation in terms that reached the people who were paying. This is a failure of translation, not a failure of achievement. The achievement was real. What was failing was the communication of its value to the people who were funding it and who had every right to understand what their sacrifice was producing. Nikephoros was not a man who managed his public image. The court ceremonial that Byzantine imperial culture had developed over centuries as a mechanism for building popular affinity with the emperor was something he performed when required and appeared to regard as a burden when not. He did not cultivate the relationships with the civilian aristocracy, the church hierarchy, and the mercantile elite that would have given those groups a stake in his success. He trusted the record of his achievements to speak for itself. The record spoke clearly to people who understood military strategy. Most of Constantinople did not. The land legislation was administratively coherent and created powerful enemies in the capital, where the civilian aristocratic families, who relied on land accumulation as their primary mechanism of wealth, found in it a direct attack on their interests. The church property legislation added the ecclesiastical hierarchy to the list of those who felt damaged by imperial policy. The ongoing theological dispute with Patriarch Polyeuctos meant that Nikephoros did not have the working relationship with the church that might have provided a counterweight to the civilian aristocracy's resentment. He had managed to accumulate opponents in almost every major constituency of the capital, while simultaneously winning every military campaign he undertook on the frontier. John Skylitzes, writing about this period, describes the mood of Constantinople during the later years of Nikephoros' reign in terms that capture something specific. It was not simple anger. It was the particular bitterness that develops when people feel their sacrifice is being taken for granted by someone who does not appear to notice it. The sources record incidents of public hostility that were not organized political opposition, but the spontaneous expression of a population that had developed a settled negative feeling about the man governing them. And Nikephoros, riding through those streets in the autumn of 968, responded in the only way he knew how. He kept moving forward. The tools that had served him through every other problem of his career, patience, preparation, systematic discipline, the application of consistent force toward a well-defined objective, were not obviously applicable to the problem of a population that disliked him for reasons that were not entirely rational and could not be resolved through any single decisive action. He could not siege-starve a grievance into surrender. He could not outflank resentment with a flanking movement. He could not apply the principles of the Praecepta Militaria to the political culture of a capital that had decided, for a combination of reasons, both fair and unfair, that the man governing it was not someone it wanted to be governed by. What he could do, and what the sources suggest he chose to do, was to interpret the domestic situation through the same framework he used for everything else. A difficult condition to be managed rather than a crisis requiring fundamental change, a problem that persistence and discipline would outlast. He had always been right about that kind of calculation before. He was not going to be right about it this time. Because while he looked east toward the frontier, he understood, and moved through the streets of the city he never fully learned to read. Something was taking shape in the rooms and corridors of the palace that his fortifications could not address, and his experience had not prepared him to see. Chapter 9. Theophano and John Tzimiskes. Power in the Byzantine court was a question of proximity, not of formal title alone, not of military capacity alone, of physical closeness to the emperor, of being in the rooms where decisions happened, of access that others did not have. of understanding, from close observation over time, the rhythms and habits and vulnerabilities of the person at the centre of the system. A general commanding on the eastern frontier held enormous power in the world outside the palace walls. Inside those walls, power was organised differently. It flowed toward people with different skills than the ones that won campaigns in Cilicia. Nikephoros had spent his reign partially outside those walls, and even when present in the palace, the sources consistently portray him as someone who inhabited the physical space of the court without fully inhabiting the social and political space it represented. He was there. He was not of it. That distinction was about to cost him everything. The two figures at the centre of what followed were among the people closest to him, in different ways, and understanding each of them separately is necessary before their convergence makes sense. Theophano first. She was probably in her mid-20s during the later years of Nikephoros' reign, which means she had already navigated more Byzantine political complexity in her short life than most people encountered across an entire lifetime. Born into circumstances that Byzantine accounts describe as relatively modest, elevated to the imperial court through marriage to Romanos II, widowed at perhaps 22, and then repositioned by the political logic of the succession into a marriage with a man who was 30 years older, temperamentally opposite, and governing the empire in a manner that her position in it did not fully reflect. Every Byzantine source that describes Theophano uses language that reflects genuine difficulty in categorization, not the simple language of villainy. Though hostile accounts move in that direction, something more complicated, an intelligence that even sources hostile to her consistently acknowledge, a capacity for long-term calculation that operated across conditions where most people were managing only the immediate situation, a political perceptiveness that expressed itself in the management of proximity, of access, of the subtle architecture of relationships in a court environment where those things determined outcomes. Whether the ambition the sources describe was as calculated from the very beginning as they suggest, or whether it developed in response to conditions she found herself navigating without having chosen them, is not something the record allows us to establish. Byzantine literary tradition had inherited from classical predecessors a set of conventions about dangerous women at court that shaped how writers described real women, whether or not those conventions accurately captured the individual case. Those conventions are present in how Theophano is described, and they require the same critical distance we would apply to any other source shaped by its cultural assumptions. What the sources record with consistency is this: the years of Nikephoros' reign were not, for Theophano, years of political participation. She had been the empress during the reign of Romanos, young as both of them were, and whatever influence she had exercised in that context, the transition to being the empress under Nikephoros had changed her actual position in ways that the formal title did not capture. Nikephoros governed through his own judgments and the council of military and administrative figures he had worked with for years. The campaigns, the legislation, the theological conflicts, the administrative choices that defined his rule were not organized around her input. Her position in the court of Nikephoros Phokas was, the sources suggest, more marginal than her title implied. She was one of the most consequential political actors in the palace, and she was, at the same time, excluded from the exercise of the power that surrounded her. That combination, for a person of her demonstrated intelligence, was not a situation that the sources suggest she found acceptable. John Tzimiskes was something different. He was family. Byzantine source, including Skylitzes, describe him as a close kinsman of Nikephoros, using a term that historians have translated as nephew or cousin, depending on interpretation, reflecting a degree of ambiguity in the original Greek that the sources do not fully resolve. What is clear is that the connection was real and recognized, and that it had translated into Nikephoros, elevating Tzimiskes to significant military commands that gave him the experience and reputation that made him, by the mid-960s, one of the recognized senior military figures of the empire. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely formidable in his own right. Leo the Deacon describes him in terms that make his gifts clear: physically imposing, charismatic, with a quality that frontier commanders who combined personal bravery with tactical intelligence tended to project, and possessed of a social fluency that Nikephoros entirely lacked. Tzimiskes could read a room. He could navigate the political culture of the court with an ease that made him effective in environments where pure military competence alone was insufficient. He had a history with Nikephoros that was not without tension. At some point in the mid-960s, Nikephoros had removed Tzimiskes from a military command. The sources do not fully agree on the reasons. Leo the Deacon suggests issues during a campaign. Skylitzes implies a more complex political dimension. What is clear is that Tzimiskes had been elevated and then demoted by the same man, a combination that the sources suggest he received with the composed patience of someone who understood that the present moment was not the final moment. He had been effectively exiled from Constantinople, living at a distance from the court, close enough to remain a known figure in the political landscape, far enough to be excluded from the proximity that palace influence required. At some point during the later period of Nikephoros' reign, the two figures found each other. The exact nature of the connection between Theophano and John Tzimiskes is stated differently in different sources, and has been debated by historians of the Byzantine period. Byzantine literary tradition, with its conventions about dangerous women and ambitious generals, produced accounts that tend toward the dramatic in ways that require critical distance. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on the convergence of the available sources, is that an arrangement formed between them that was directed at changing who occupied the throne, and that each provided what the other could not provide alone. Theophano had access. She was inside the palace, inside the ceremonial structure, inside the physical proximity to Nikephoros that Tzimiskes in his effective exile could not provide for himself. Whatever the arrangement between them in its full dimensions, it solved a practical problem that neither could solve independently. Tzimiskes had the military standing, the relationships with soldiers and commanders who had served under him, and the capacity for action. Theophano had the geography of the inside. The conspiracy that formed around this combination did not form in isolation. Byzantine court conspiracies rarely involved only two principals. There were other figures, military commanders with grievances, court figures who had calculated that the present situation was not one they wished to see continue. The sources name some of them. Others were surely present, but went unrecorded or deliberately obscured in accounts written after the conspiracy succeeded. When the new regime had an interest in shaping the narrative of how it had come to power, What is striking, and what the sources all note in their different ways, is how little opposition the conspiracy encountered as it developed. This was not because it was perfectly secret. Byzantine courts were not environments in which major political arrangements stayed genuinely hidden for long. Information moved through the court in the way water moves through a porous material, finding every available path, reaching unexpected places. The fact that the conspiracy against Nikephoros developed to the point it reached without being intercepted does not speak to the perfection of the conspirators' operational security. It speaks to how many people had done their calculation and decided that the outcome did not require their intervention. There were people who knew, or suspected, and chose not to warn him. That is perhaps the most revealing single fact about where Nikephoros stood in his own palace by the later months of 969. The man who had earned the absolute loyalty of soldiers who followed him through decades of frontier warfare was living in a building where the people around him had done their arithmetic about what was coming and had decided that informing him was not the result that arithmetic pointed toward. The record suggests he was not entirely without awareness of danger in a general sense. The fortifications added to the palace during his reign, the controlled access to his personal chambers, the careful arrangements around where and how he slept, these speak to a man operating with some consciousness that the environment had become hostile. But general awareness of danger is not the same as specific intelligence about a specific plan with a specific timeline, and the threat in the palace, unlike the threats on the frontier, came from no mappable direction, wore the faces of people he had known, and in some cases elevated, and operated by methods that the Praecepta Militaria had no chapter on. December of 969 arrived. The frontier was holding. The eastern border was more secure than it had been in a century. The Aegean was quieter than anyone in Constantinople could remember. Inside the palace, the arrangement that had been taking shape was ready. All it needed now was a night. Chapter 10. The Last Night, December 10th, 969. The Palace of Constantinople after dark. Stone corridors. The cold that comes off the Marmara in winter, finding its way through walls that are thick enough to stop armies, but not thick enough to stop December. Lamps burning in the ceremonial spaces, dimmer in the private ones, absent altogether in the corridors that serve the practical functions of a large building rather than its public face, the kind of darkness that exists in large old structures at night. Not the total darkness of open country, but the layered darkness of enclosed space, with pools of dim light at irregular intervals and long stretches of shadow between them. Nikephoros was asleep, not in the imperial bedchamber, where the bed stood, that the position provided for him and that the position expected him to use, on the floor of a private chamber, in the manner he had slept since his frontier years, on a rough wool garment with no cushion and no fire, in the cold, in the dark, as he had slept through every campaign and every winter posting, and every year of the reign he had accepted as a burden rather than a prize. What Leo the Deacon records in his Historia, and what historians have read and analysed for more than 1,000 years, is the sequence of what happened next. The account has the qualities of historical reconstruction rather than eyewitness testimony. Leo the Deacon was a young man at the time, gathering his account from people who were present or close to the events. It carries the marks of that process. It is not a perfect record. It is the best available record of something that happened in a specific room on a specific night, and it is detailed enough that the sequence can be followed. A window, on the side of the palace, facing the sea, left accessible from within. Tzimiskes and a group of associates entered through it. The exact membership of the group that came through that window is named partially in the sources and debated by historians. What is consistent across the accounts is the mechanism of entry, the window, the sea side of the palace, the darkness, and the arrangement that made it possible from the inside. They moved through the palace. The imperial bedchamber was empty. The man they were looking for was not in the bed that his position had provided. This pause in the sequence, this moment of not finding him where an emperor should have been, carries its own quiet weight. The stone floor and the rough wool garment had, for once, served as something other than personal discipline. They had, for a moment, made him harder to find. The moment passed. They found him. What happened in that chamber is described by Leo the Deacon in terms that do not require elaboration to convey what they convey. It was a violent conclusion, the kind that Byzantine political transitions in their darker episodes were capable of producing, the kind that was designed to be complete and irreversible rather than to offer any possibility that could not be managed. Nikephoros Phokas was killed on the night of December 10th to 11th, 969, in the chamber where he had chosen to sleep. By men, led by the kinsman, he had elevated, in an arrangement made possible by the empress he had married. He was approximately 57 years old. He had commanded an army for 30 years without losing a major campaign. He had taken back Crete after 135 years of occupation. He had pushed the frontier of the empire further east than any emperor in 3 centuries. He had written down what he knew so that others could use it after him. He had funded the building of a monastery that would stand for more than 1,000 years. He died on a cold floor. In the hours that followed, the palace reorganized itself around the new reality with the efficiency that Byzantine institutions had developed over centuries of political transition. John Tzimiskes was proclaimed emperor before the night was fully over. The court figures who had been waiting for the outcome that the night produced adjusted their positions accordingly, the way a compass needle adjusts when the magnetic field shifts. By morning, the transition was effectively complete. Theophano's position in the aftermath was not what she had perhaps calculated it would be. The Patriarch of Constantinople, whose cooperation was required for Tzimiskes to be crowned, had conditions. Theophano was one of them. Her exile from the capital was required before the coronation could proceed. Tzimiskes accepted the condition. The woman who had provided the access that made the night possible was removed from Constantinople as one of the first acts of the reign that night had produced. What she understood about that outcome in the days after December 10th, the sources do not record. What they record is the fact itself. The cold stone floor of the chamber where Nikephoros had slept was empty. The frontier was holding. And Constantinople, which had organized itself around many emperors across many centuries, organized itself around a new one with the particular efficiency of a place that had learned to do exactly that. Chapter 11. The Long Shadow. There is a question underneath this entire story that the story itself does not fully resolve. Not the question of whether Nikephoros Phokas was consequential. The record resolves that clearly enough. by the measures his civilization used to assess consequence, the territorial extent of the empire, the security of the frontier, the quality of the military tradition he left behind, the physical monuments that remained after him, the answer is not ambiguous. He was among the most consequential figures the Byzantine Empire produced in the 10th century, and the 10th century was not a century short of consequential figures. The question is different, and it is the kind of question that sits in the mind after a story like this one, not demanding an answer, but refusing to be dismissed entirely. How does a person become genuinely extraordinary in almost every domain of their existence, and still fail to fully see the most immediate human environment around them? The sources all circle it. Leo the Deacon, John Skylitzes, the later Byzantine historians who drew on both, they describe a figure of obvious and authentic greatness, and they describe a man whose end was produced by failures of perception that the record will not allow us to attribute to stupidity or ignorance. He was not unintelligent. He was not uninformed in any general sense. He had spent his career reading complex situations with exceptional accuracy. The application of that same intelligence to the political environment of his own court produced results that were, in the end, fatally insufficient. But before we sit too long in that question, let us be specific about what he left. The empire's borders, at the time of his death, in 969, were the most extensive they had been in approximately 300 years. Crete was Byzantine. Cilicia was Byzantine. The Syrian frontier had been pushed to positions not held since before the great Arab expansion of the 7th century. Cyprus was secure. The Aegean was safer than it had been in living memory. These were not abstract strategic improvements on a map. They were concrete, territorial and security gains that shaped the daily lives of real people in real places for generations after the man who produced them was gone. The Praecepta Militaria, the military manual attributed to his reign and his direct influence, was studied by Byzantine commanders for more than a century after his death. Historians of Byzantine warfare, working from the evidence of how Byzantine military operations were conducted in the decades following his reign, have identified the operational principles articulated in that document in the choices made by commanders who came after him. The knowledge he had accumulated on the eastern frontier, formalized and made transferable through that text, outlasted him in the specific sense that it shaped how the empire fought wars after he was no longer alive to fight them himself. That is an unusual kind of legacy, not simply the legacy of achievements, but the legacy of method, of a way of thinking about a problem that proved durable enough to be used by people who had never met the man who had developed it, and Megisti Lavra is still there. On the rocky peninsula in northern Greece, in the cold water of the northern Aegean, the monastery that Nikephoros funded in 963, that he helped Athanasius establish in one of the most remote locations in the Christian world, has been continuously occupied for more than 1,060 years. It has survived the fall of the Byzantine Empire. It has survived the Ottoman centuries. It has survived the modern era. It functions today as a monastic community in the Eastern Christian tradition. The church, built with resources provided by an emperor who slept on stone floors and wore a hair shirt under his imperial robes, can be visited by a person with the appropriate permit on any day of any year. That is a kind of permanence that very few human beings leave behind. John Tzimiskes, the man who came through the window and inherited the empire Nikephoros had spent his life building, reigned for 6 years, and died in 976. He was, by most historical assessments, a capable emperor, and he continued many of the military policies that Nikephoros had established. He conducted campaigns in Bulgaria and Syria in the early 970s that extended the gains of the previous reign. The man who had killed Nikephoros did not repudiate what Nikephoros had built. He used it, and in using it, he provided an unintentional testimony to its quality. The murderer inherited the achievement and built upon it. The achievement was real enough to survive the manner of its transition. The 2 young sons of Romanos II, the children whose formal status as legitimate emperors had provided the constitutional framework within which Nikephoros had governed, eventually came to rule in their own right. Basil II, who would become known as Basil Bulgaroctonos, the Bulgar Slayer, reigned from 976 to 1025, and is considered by most historians one of the most capable emperors in Byzantine history. The empire that Basil inherited and then dramatically extended had been shaped in significant part by the military and strategic work that Nikephoros had done in the generation before him. The long stability of Byzantine power in the late 10th and early 11th centuries was built on foundations that Nikephoros had laid and that Tzimiskes had maintained. The contributions of that earlier generation are not always visible in the histories that focus on Basil's remarkable reign, but they are present in the conditions that made it possible. What the historical record does not give us is certainty about how Nikephoros understood his own life. We cannot know whether he experienced the reign as a burden accepted out of duty, as the Byzantine sources consistently portray it, or whether that portrayal reflects the conventions of how Byzantine writers described certain kinds of leaders more than it reflects his actual inner orientation. We cannot know whether the ascetic practices that every source records were an expression of genuine spiritual conviction, a form of psychological discipline that a man of his formation required, or some combination of both that even he could not have fully separated. We cannot know whether the domestic political failures of his reign were failures he recognized but could not correct, or whether they were genuinely invisible to him until the consequences had already become irreversible. The sources suggest, without confirming, that he saw more than he acted on. The fortifications of the palace, the controlled access to his chambers, the careful sleeping arrangements, these speak to a man who understood in some form that his environment had become dangerous. Whether he underestimated the specific danger or calculated that acting on incomplete suspicions carried a cost higher than the risk of waiting, the record will not say. What it says is simpler and final. He was on the floor of a cold room. The men who came for him came through a window. The person who arranged the window was the person he had married. The person who led the men through it was the person he had elevated. And in the morning, the empire was still there. The frontier was holding. Crete was Byzantine. The Aegean was quiet. The monastery on Athos was 9 years old, and already permanent in the way that only stone and genuine faith together can produce permanence. A man had lived with extraordinary discipline and left behind extraordinary things. He had slept on the floor of every room the world put him in, from the frontier camps of the eastern border to the private chambers of the greatest palace in the Christian world. Not as performance, not as statement, but because that was simply who he was, a soldier, and underneath the soldier, something that looked very much like a monk, wearing the purple because the empire required it of him, and returning to the stone floor, because that was where he actually lived. He had built an empire back from its edges. He had written down what he knew. He had built a monastery that is still standing, and he had died in the cold. On the floor he had chosen, unable to see the threat that wore the faces of the people he had trusted most. Now, go back to the beginning of this story. Go back to the room, the cold stone floor, December 10th, 969. The dark, the sound of the Marmara through the palace walls. A figure lying in the manner of a soldier, in the manner of a monk, in the manner of a man who had decided very early in his life that what the world offered in the way of comfort was not something he required. He was extraordinary. He was blind to the one thing that killed him. And the empire he built with his life outlasted the night that took it from him. That is where this story ends, and that is why it stays with you.